The city was in chaos. A deafening explosion shattered the silence of the busy streets, shaking the foundations of buildings and sending a shockwave through the city. A towering skyscraper that had once symbolized wealth and success was now crumbling in flames. People scattered in every direction, their screams drowned out by the roar of the fire. Sirens screamed in the distance, but they were too far away to offer any comfort to the terrified onlookers. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. Glass shattered from windows, and debris rained down, crashing onto the ground with terrifying force. The air was filled with the acrid smell of burning wood and metal, as the once proud building crumbled under the pressure of the blast. Amid the chaos, one figure was trapped, Agent Hernandez, the leader of the FBI operation, buried under a pile of concrete and steel, unconscious, and struggling to breathe beneath the weight of the wreckage. People rushed to safety, but not everyone was running in fear. Among the terrified crowd stood Jaden, a 15-year-old black boy, who had been walking down the street running errands for his family. He had lived in this city his entire life, seen too many things he shouldn't have, and survived situations that no kid should have to experience. But nothing could prepare him for this. He saw the explosion. He saw the smoke, the chaos, the screams. But most importantly, he saw her, the agent trapped under the wreckage, barely visible beneath the debris. Without thinking about the risk, Jaden's instincts kicked in. He didn't stop to consider the danger. He didn't stop to think about whether he was capable or whether he'd get hurt. He simply ran toward the wreckage. Dodging falling debris and narrowly avoiding the fiery wreckage that was consuming the building, Jaden sprinted toward the agent, his heart pounding in his chest. The smoke was thick, the flames licking the edges of the building, but he didn't stop. He reached Hernandez, who was half-conscious, her face bruised and bloodied. She was still alive, but only just. Jaden's small frame was no match for the heavy rubble that pinned her down, but he didn't let that stop him. With his bare hands, he started to push aside the debris, his muscles straining with each movement. The heat from the fire pressed against his skin, threatening to overwhelm him, but his focus never wavered. The sounds of the fire, the cracking of the building around him, only fueled his determination. The seconds felt like hours, but Jaden kept working, lifting piece after piece of the rubble. He felt his strength fading, his vision blurring, but there was no time to stop. The explosion had been massive, and another wave of debris was coming. He had to get her out before it was too late. With one final effort, Jaden pulled the last of the debris off Hernandez, his hands shaking from exhaustion. He grabbed her and pulled her into his arms, lifting her against the odds. The fire behind them roared to life again, the flames threatening to devour everything in its path. But Jaden didn't look back. He pushed forward, every step more difficult than the last. His legs burned with fatigue, but he kept moving, driven by nothing but the knowledge that this was his moment to save her. Just as he reached a safe distance, the building groaned and another chunk of it collapsed, sending debris crashing to the ground with a deafening sound. Jaden's heart raced as the blast from the collapse hit him, but he didn't stop. He had done it. He had saved her. The crowd, which had initially been frozen in disbelief, slowly started to react. Some were clapping, others cheering, but most stood there, their eyes wide with awe. A few began filming the scene, capturing every moment of the young boy's bravery. News outlets began to buzz, and social media was quick to pick up on the story of Jaden's courageous act. But as the cheers began to grow, something darker started to seep in. The whispers began, soft at first, but growing louder. A voice from the crowd muttered, "What's he doing with the agent?" Was he involved in the explosion? Another voice joined in. Shouldn't he have stayed away from the wreckage? A kid like him doesn't belong in this situation. Jaden, his heart still racing from the adrenaline, overheard the comments. He shook his head, trying to push the words out of his mind, but they lingered, stinging deeper than any physical injury could have. He had done what no one else could. He had saved a life, but to some, his race and his background overshadowed the heroism he had shown. The crowd, once cheering, began to look at him with suspicion. Some seemed to view him as nothing more than a problem. They didn't see him for what he was, just a kid who saw a person in need and stepped up without thinking. They saw him as a symbol of everything they wanted to ignore. But Jaden didn't let it show. He kept walking, ignoring the whispers, focusing on the agent in his arms. It didn't matter what they thought of him. He had done what was right. He was a hero, not because of what he had done for recognition, but because he had acted when no one else would. The crowd's murmurs only grew louder, but Jaden didn't look back. He had saved Agent Hernandez, and that was all that mattered. Jaden woke up with a sense of accomplishment. The rush of adrenaline from the previous day had worn off, but the memories of saving Agent Hernandez were still fresh in his mind. He had risked everything to save her life, and for a brief moment, he had felt like the world finally saw him. Not as just a kid from the streets, but as a hero. The words of praise and admiration that had followed him after the rescue had filled him with pride. He had done the right thing, and for once, he felt like the world might finally recognize his worth. But that morning, that fleeting sense of triumph quickly evaporated when he heard the knock at the door. Before he could react, the door was pushed open, and 2 local officers barged into the room. Jaden froze. He didn't know what was going on, but his heart began to pound as they stepped forward, their stern faces filled with suspicion. "Jaden Davis," one of the officers said coldly. "You're under arrest." Jaden blinked in disbelief. "What for?" he asked, his voice trembling. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had saved a life. "You're accused of looting during the explosion," the officer continued. "We believe you were involved in the chaos. Your presence in the area makes you a suspect." Jaden's mind raced as he tried to process the words. Looting? How could they possibly accuse him of such a thing? He had been there, yes, but only to help. He had risked his own life to save someone, and now they were accusing him of being part of the problem. "You've got to be kidding me," Jaden said, his voice filled with frustration. "I wasn't stealing anything. I was trying to save a life." The officers didn't respond. They didn't need to listen to his explanation. Without another word, they slapped handcuffs on him, dragging his arms behind his back with force. "Stop! You can't do this!" Jaden shouted, his voice cracking. But the officers ignored him, their hands firm and unyielding. He was powerless. Outside, the scene was already unfolding. The streets were filled with the buzz of onlookers, many of whom had witnessed Jaden's act of bravery the day before. But today, there was no cheering. There were no words of encouragement. Instead, the crowd stood silent, as if unsure of how to react to what was happening. A few muttered amongst themselves, their voices barely audible. "Why is he being arrested?" someone whispered. "He's just a kid, a criminal in disguise." Another person sneered, as if the simple act of being from a poor neighborhood had condemned him. Jaden's heart sank as he looked around. People he had known his whole life, neighbors, acquaintances, turned their heads, avoiding eye contact. They had cheered for him the day before. They had applauded his courage, his bravery. But now, with the police around him, they remained eerily silent. Some even looked away in fear, unwilling to stand up for him. "What's happening?" Jaden thought to himself as the weight of the moment settled in. Just yesterday, he had been hailed as a hero. Today, he was being dragged through the streets like a criminal. His hands burned in the cuffs, but the sting of rejection cut deeper. Jaden tried to speak to explain himself, but his voice was drowned out by the officer's harsh words. "Shut up, kid. You're a troublemaker," one of them spat, pushing him toward the squad car. "You should have stayed out of it. This isn't your fight." His mind raced as he thought about what had changed. Just yesterday, the city had applauded him, recognizing him as the boy who had saved a life. Now, his heroism meant nothing. He was nothing more than a statistic, a young black boy from the wrong side of town. His race and background had once again overshadowed everything else. The world had seen him as a hero because it suited their narrative. But now that the narrative had shifted, so had their perception of him. Jaden's pleas for justice went unheard as the officers shoved him into the back of the squad car. His eyes darted around the crowd, hoping to see someone, anyone, speak up. But the silence hung heavy in the air. The people who had once cheered for him now stood by, frozen in place, unwilling to challenge the officers who had the power. As the squad car door slammed shut, Jaden's heart dropped. He had saved a life. He had done the right thing. But none of it mattered anymore. Yesterday, he was a hero. Today, he was a criminal. And in that moment, Jaden realized the harsh truth. The world was never going to see him for who he truly was. It was never going to be enough. Jaden sat in the cold, sterile holding cell, his hands trembling as he leaned against the wall. The metal bars felt like a prison, even though his body wasn't physically confined. The noise of the busy police station outside seemed distant, muffled by the overwhelming weight of confusion and frustration. He had saved a life, Agent Hernandez's life, and now he was being treated like a criminal. His mind raced as he replayed the events over and over again. How had it all gone so wrong? He could still hear the whispers from the crowd, the judgment in their eyes. He had done what no one else was brave enough to do, and yet here he was, handcuffed, accused, abandoned. The world had been quick to label him a hero one moment, and now, just as fast, they had cast him aside. The sting of rejection cut deeper than the handcuffs on his wrists. But then, the door to his cell swung open, and for the first time since his arrest, hope flickered in his chest. Standing in front of him was none other than Agent Hernandez. She was standing tall, her face serious, but her eyes softened when they met his. "Jaden," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You're not supposed to be here." Jaden looked up at her, disbelief and relief flooding his chest. "Agent Hernandez?" he asked, his voice shaky. You're okay?" She nodded, giving him a small smile. "I'm fine, thanks to you." Before Jaden could say anything else, Hernandez turned to the officers nearby, her gaze sharp. "Get him out of here," she commanded. "Now." The officers hesitated, but then reluctantly unlocked the cell. As Jaden walked out, he could see the disbelief on their faces. Agent Hernandez had that effect on people. Her authority demanded attention. She was the one who had survived, thanks to Jaden, and she wasn't going to let the system silence him now. Once they were outside the holding area, Hernandez turned to face the officers who had arrested Jaden. She didn't mince words. "This kid saved my life yesterday," she said, her voice shaking with fury. He put himself at risk for someone he didn't know, and you arrested him for doing the right thing." The officers looked stunned, but Hernandez wasn't finished. She stepped forward, her posture strong, her words like daggers. "You think you're doing your job, but what you're doing is perpetuating the very thing that keeps this system broken: racism, bias, and injustice. That's what you're upholding when you treat him like this. You should be ashamed of yourselves." There was a tense silence, but Hernandez wasn't waiting for their apology. She turned away from them, her gaze focused on Jaden. "I'm sorry, Jaden. This isn't right, but we're going to fix it," she said with determination. Later that day, Hernandez held a press conference in front of the station. Reporters crowded around her, eager for answers, for clarity on the situation. She stood at the podium, calm but with an undeniable fire in her eyes. "Yesterday, Jaden did something that many of us would have hesitated to do," Hernandez began, her voice unwavering. "He saved my life. In the middle of chaos and danger, he acted when no one else did. And what does he get for his bravery? He gets arrested." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "This is the exact behavior that perpetuates injustice and fuels a system of oppression. Jaden is a hero. He proved that in the moment when many of us would have run. We should be praising him, not questioning him. And I am standing here to say that we owe him an apology." The room fell silent. Journalists quickly typed away, eager to report on the breaking story. Hernandez's words were powerful, and they rang true. The media began to turn against the officers, and the public outcry grew louder. Social media exploded with support for Jaden, rallying behind his courage and condemning the wrongful actions of the police officers. Hernandez's stance had forced the community to reckon with its own biases, and slowly the narrative began to shift. No longer was Jaden a suspect. He was a hero, recognized not just by the FBI, but by the public at large. As the press conference ended, Hernandez turned to Jaden, who was standing quietly by her side. A small smile tugged at his lips, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt seen. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't just another statistic. He was a young man who had done something extraordinary, and the world was starting to recognize it. "I won't let them take away what you did," Hernandez said softly to him. "You saved my life, Jaden, and that's something no one can take from you." Later that week, the world that had once doubted Jaden's worth began to recognize his true value. The media continued to cover his story, his name becoming synonymous with courage and selflessness. The support for him had reached a boiling point, and now, as the dust began to settle, something extraordinary happened. Agent Hernandez, the woman whose life Jaden had saved, stood before him once more. But this time, it wasn't just a moment of gratitude. It was a promise of a future. In the center of the same building that had once seemed like a distant dream to him, she presented Jaden with an envelope. It wasn't just any envelope. It held the key to an opportunity he never imagined. "Jaden," Hernandez said, her voice filled with warmth and admiration, "you showed us all what real courage is. You acted when others wouldn't. And because of that, I'm offering you a scholarship to the FBI's Youth Development Program." Jaden stood frozen, unsure of whether he had heard her correctly. His mind raced as Hernandez continued. "This world needs more people like you, people who step up even when they have no reason to. This isn't just a scholarship. This is a promise of mentorship, growth, and a future that was once out of reach for you." The weight of her words hit him all at once. He had never imagined his life would take this turn. growing up in an underserved neighborhood where the odds were stacked against him. He had learned to survive. But now, here was an opportunity not just to survive, but to thrive. The path forward was no longer a distant dream. It was within his grasp, and it all started with one heroic act. Hernandez placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression full of pride. "You've earned this, Jaden. I'll be here to guide you, and I know you'll go far." Jaden's heart swelled with emotion. He looked down at the scholarship in his hands, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. The young boy who had been written off by so many, the one who had been judged by the color of his skin and the neighborhood he came from, was now being given the chance of a lifetime. For the first time, he truly believed that he could change the course of his life and maybe, just maybe, change the world. Later that day, in a public ceremony filled with reporters, law enforcement officials, and community members, Hernandez made a heartfelt apology to Jaden. Standing in front of the gathered crowd, she spoke with conviction. "I want to publicly apologize to Jaden for the treatment he received at the hands of certain members of law enforcement," Hernandez said, her voice strong yet compassionate. "What happened to him was wrong, and I will fight for systemic change within our justice system, inspired by Jaden's example." The crowd, which had once been silent, now erupted into applause. People stood up, some wiping tears from their eyes, while others cheered for the young hero who had shown them all what real bravery looked like. Jaden stood at the center of it all, the weight of the moment settling in. For the first time in his life, Jaden felt seen. He wasn't just the kid from the streets anymore. He was a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of the power of doing what's right, even when the world tells you not to. As the applause continued, Jaden stood tall, his head held high. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. He was no longer just fighting for survival. He was fighting for a future, and for the first time, the future looked bright. 5 years had passed since Jaden's heroic act, the day he saved Agent Hernandez, and the day his life had taken a dramatic turn. In that time, Jaden had risen from a boy marked by poverty and prejudice to a man who had earned his place among the elite of the FBI. His journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it had also been filled with purpose. Every step forward was a testament to his resilience, to the strength that had carried him through the worst of times. Now, as Jaden walked through the doors of the FBI headquarters, his footsteps were steady and confident. His suit was crisp, the fabric sharp and fitting, reflecting the transformation he had undergone. The young, homeless boy who had once been dismissed by the world was now an officer, one of the brightest minds in the agency, with a reputation that demanded respect. As he walked down the familiar hallway, memories flooded back. The halls that had once seemed so distant and unreachable were now his workplace, a space he had earned through hard work, dedication, and a deep sense of justice. It wasn't just about the badge or the title. It was about what the badge represented, a commitment to change, to fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves, and to ensuring that no one was ever judged by the circumstances of their birth. At the end of the hall, Jaden found what he was looking for, Agent Hernandez. She stood there, her back straight, her eyes filled with pride as she watched him approach. She hadn't changed much over the years. Her presence was still commanding, her aura one of strength and compassion. "Jaden," she said, her voice warm as she extended her hand, "I knew you were destined for this. You've earned everything." Jaden smiled as he shook her hand, his heart swelling with gratitude. It was impossible to express how much she had meant to him throughout his journey. She had seen his potential when no one else did, had believed in him when the system tried to break him down. And now, here they were, together in this moment of triumph. "You've been like a second mother to me, Agent Hernandez," Jaden said, his voice filled with sincerity. "None of this would have been possible without you." She smiled, her eyes glistening with pride. "You did it, Jaden. You proved everyone wrong, and you changed the game. This isn't just about being an agent. It's about showing the world that we can change the system. You're part of something bigger now." As Jaden looked around the office, he saw familiar faces, colleagues, many of whom had once doubted him. They watched him with a mixture of respect and acknowledgement. Some nodded as he passed by, their eyes no longer filled with skepticism, but admiration. He could feel their gaze, but it didn't faze him. He had earned their respect, not through words, but through actions. His mind drifted back to the moment when he had been arrested by racist officers, when the world had turned its back on him. But now, those officers were nothing more than a distant memory, an obstacle he had overcome. He had proven that his actions, not his background or the color of his skin, defined who he was. And today, in this moment, he was finally able to say that he had changed the system. Jaden's thoughts were interrupted as Hernandez placed a hand on his shoulder. "This is your moment, Jaden. You're not just a part of the system now. You're the one who's going to change it from the inside." Jaden nodded, his chest swelling with pride. It wasn't about the suit, the badge, or the recognition. It was about the legacy he was leaving behind. A legacy that would inspire others like him, others who had been told they were nothing, to rise up and claim their worth. The final scene unfolded as Jaden walked out of the building, his head held high, his future bright. The sun shone through the windows, casting a golden light on everything he had worked for. As he stepped out into the sunlight, he knew this was just the beginning. He had gone from a boy who saved a life to a man who had changed the system. The city he had once struggled to survive in was now his to shape. Jaden smiled to himself as he looked out at the horizon. He was no longer just a statistic. He was the man who had rewritten his own story. And with that, the story of his transformation, of his rise from the streets to the FBI, came full circle.